Hilchos Maaseh Hakorbanos Perek Shmini, the laws of sacrificial procedures, chapter 8. Today we are focused on the korban chatas, the sin offering, but not so much about the procedure surrounding it, but a very specific law that applies only to the chatas and to nothing else. And we basically take a pause, talking about the procedures of all the different types of sacrifices, to dive in to this special law of the korban chatas. And it has to do with the blood of this korban. Says the Rambam, Chomer bechatas habehema mishar kodshe kodshim. There's a stringency when it comes to the animal sin offering that doesn't exist in any other holy sacrifice. What is that? Shedam chatas habehema. You have the blood of an animal sin offering. Shenitaz min hakli shekibel bayhadam. If it spritzed, what do you say? If it sprinkled, right? From the utensil in which you received the blood. Koidem hazaya. Before you sprinkled it on the mizbeach. Al habeged. If blood got onto a piece of clothing, in other words, like this. Yeah, the chatas is slaughtered like a regular sacrifice. You receive the blood, then you take the blood onto the mizbeach to do a special sprinkling. If between this and this, between here and here, if the blood got onto a piece of clothing, so you have a shirt, got a blood stain, or think of the Kohen's clothes, or think of somebody walking through the Azara, their clothes. If the blood spritches onto a clothing, ton kibus b'mayim ba'azara. Special halacha, this piece of clothing is impure. It needs to be dipped in the mikveh in the temple courtyard. Right there.
Immediately.
Right there. Shanemar, as it says, this is the verse about the korban chatas. In the bottom it says, Koila asher yiga bivsara yikdash. Whoever touches its flesh will become holy. We'll see about that soon. Va'asher yizeh midama al habeged. If its blood sprinkles onto a piece of clothing, asher yizeh aleh techabes b'makom kadosh. The clothing upon which it sprinkles has to be washed in a holy place, which means in the temple courtyard. Asher yizeh midama al habeged, asher yizeh aleh techabes b'makom kadosh. Yeah, exactly. Now, even though in the Torah it says the word beged, which means article of clothing like a jacket or a shirt, the Rambam says right away, echad ha-beged, ve'echad ha'ir harach, ve'echad ha-sak. Doesn't matter if it's a piece of clothing, or it's soft leather, or it's sack material. Burlap, rougher material. Tu'unin kibus. All these three require washing in the mikveh. Aval ha'ir ha-kasha, but if it's hard leather, harihu ka'etz. That's like wood, v'graded hadam me'alav. You simply scrape the blood off of it. See, in clothing or in sack, the blood will get absorbed into the material. So you have to put it in the mikveh and wash it properly. Harder leather, no big deal. This law applies whether the sin offering is being eaten or it's being burnt. But not a bird sin offering. Shanemar, because the verse just before, the opening verse of the passage about the korban chatas, it says, Tishachet hachatas. We're talking about a sin offering which is slaughtered. It's an animal which is slaughtered normally, not the bird which is slaughtered backwards from the back of the neck with the nail. This law doesn't apply to the bird, only to the animal. Halacha gimel chatas shenifsalam. If there was a sin offering which became disqualified, and there's many ways that a sin offering can become disqualified if something was done wrong in its service, and there's a whole section of laws called Psulei HaMukdashin, disqualified sacrifices, where he discusses at length all the different methods of disqualification. But suffice it to say, if the sin offering becomes disqualified, ein damaton kibus. Its blood doesn't have that effect. Since it's not a kosher sacrifice, so if its blood gets onto a piece of clothing, it doesn't require it to be washed. Bein shehoisa l'shas hakosher, bein shelo hoisa l'shas hakosher. Whether it had a moment when it was kosher, or there was never a moment when it was kosher, it became disqualified from the outset. For example, says the Rambam, Ezehi shehoisa l'shas hakosher. What would be an example of a disqualified sin offering which had a momentary kosher time? Shalana. One example would be if it stayed overnight. You can only eat holy sacrifices, what's called liyom v'layla ad chatzot, as we say in davening in the morning, for that day and the night until midnight. So if it stays overnight, disqualified. B'shenitmis, or if the animal became impure. B'sheyatzas chutz la'azara, if the meat was taken outside of the temple courtyard. Those are all cases where there was a moment in time when it was kosher. Now it became unkosher. At this point, the blood doesn't require the mikveh. What's an example of a sin offering that disqualified, never had a moment when it was kosher? If in the slaughtering it was bad, or in the sprinkling of the blood it was done incorrectly, then that of course is disqualified right away, and so there's no moment of being kosher, but then for sure the blood doesn't have the special law. Halacha daled, ein ton kibus ala mokem adam bilvad. The only part that needs washing is the place where the blood goes, where the blood stain is. It also has to be on a utensil which is susceptible to impurity and could be washed. In the Rambam's 10th book, we're going to learn many materials are susceptible, they could become impure, many materials cannot. So it has to be a material which is susceptible to impurity. For example, if the blood would sprinkle onto a wooden utensil or onto a metal utensil, that wouldn't require washing, because such material can't be washed. You simply scrape it off. Once the blood dries up, you can scrape it right off and it'll come right off. Unlike, let's say, in a material or in a clothing where it makes a stain. If the blood spritzed onto fish skin, doesn't require washing, as we're going to see in the 10th book. Fish skin cannot become impure.
How fish get to that?
Yeah, I don't know. Today you don't really hear of processed fish skin.
No,
but you could. But I guess
every part of
no. But there are some types of fish that have a rougher skin which could be processed into something. It doesn't be a piece of clothing, but it could be, a cloth. You could have that. So if it happens, it doesn't require it to be washed because it can't become impure. But if it spritzed onto the hide of an animal, if the hide was not skinned yet off the animal, it doesn't require washing. But once it's been skinned, it requires washing. Even though, again, as we're going to see these laws in detail, when a leather or hide hasn't yet been processed, it's not able to receive impurity. But nevertheless, it's inherently able. If you'll process it properly, it will become fit for impurity. So that's called roy lekabel tuma, even though right now it's not fit for impurity. Halacha vav. Nitaz min hatzavar al habeged. What if the blood didn't come from the cup in which it was received? It came straight from the neck. It was a messy slaughtering. You put the knife in, boom, the blood starts going all over the place. And straight from the neck, it goes onto somebody's clothing, or from the corner of the altar. Let's say the Kohen went up here, he applies the blood to the corner, and he applied too much blood, and it drips, and it gets on someone's clothing. Or the blood spilled onto the floor, and you gathered it up, and as you're gathering it up, it spritzes onto a piece of clothing. That's all these cases is not required to be washed, because the verse says, it needs to be sprinkled from the blood, from its blood which was received in the holy vessel. It has to be a type of, let's call it sprinkleable blood. Blood that was caught into the holy utensil, blood that could be technically sprinkled on the mizbeach. It has the amount that would be sprinkled on the mizbeach. Just instead of being on the mizbeach, it ends up on somebody's clothing. Halacha zayin, nosan arba hamatonos. You did everything right. You slaughtered it, brought it to the mizbeach, applied the blood to all four corners as you're supposed to do on the sin offering, and then the leftover blood spritzes onto somebody's clothing. Eineton kibus doesn't have the law, doesn't require washing. Even though you're missing the last step, because the remainder of the blood would go onto the mizbeach's base, as we saw the other day, and technically you haven't finished the service of the blood. No, but you've already applied all the matanos around the mizbeach, you're good. Same thing applies with the burnt sin offerings, where the blood that they have is sprinkled not on the mizbeach, but inside the temple structure, and on the parochet, or on the mizbeach inside. Once you're done, you're good. Similarly, if the Kohen applied the blood to the mizbeach, and then the blood came and sprinkled not from the cup in which it's in, but from his finger, Eineton kibus doesn't require washing. Because the leftover blood on your finger cannot be sprinkled. and only sprinkleable blood causes this problem. Halacha test, nitas min habeged lebeged sheni. This could happen. Blood got sprinkled onto one piece of clothing, and there was so much blood that from that one piece of clothing, it went to the next piece of clothing. Eina beged hasheni ton kibus. The second clothing is not required to be washed. Nitas al beged tameh. If it went onto a piece of clothing that was already impure, eina ton kibus doesn't require the washing. Nitas dam hachatas al beged. V'nitas al dam hachatas dam chulin. What if you have two layers of blood? So let's say this would be the blood of the actual sin offering, and then on top of this blood was sprinkled another layer of regular blood. Ton kibus. It requires washing because the first blood to come in contact with the clothing is holy blood. Avalim nitas dam chulin tchila, oyafilu dam oilam. If first there was regular blood, or even blood from a burnt offering, not the chatas, so with regards to this law, it's just all called regular blood, but nitas alav dam hachatas, and on top of that came the chatas blood, eineton kibus, shari leiniv labai. Doesn't require it to be washed because the chatas blood in this scenario would not have become swallowed or absorbed into the material. Halacha yud. When you wash the place of the blood, this whole kibus that we're talking about this whole time. I think in the beginning of the chapter I said mikveh, but it's more like an actual washing procedure. When you wash it, when you wash this place, you launder this place, you have to wash it with water very well till no mark remains, which is pretty hard, like you said. If it's on white clothing, it's very hard to get a blood stain out of there. And one of the tricks, says the Rambam, v'chol shivas hasamimonim, shema'avirin ala kesem, ma'avirin al dam chatas. All the 7 ingredients which we use to get rid of or to check the status of a blood stain when it comes to the laws of nida. The Rambam, in the Rambam's 5th book, when we learned about nida, the Rambam said that if there's a stain discovered in a woman's clothing, one of the ways you could know if it came from the uterus or it came from somewhere else is by putting these 7 ingredients. Here we named some of them. These were, some bleach, some lye. There was a blue stone that Rambam references, different powders. I think the technical names for these plants, by Rabbi Kapach, he talks about some of these. Althe, anabis, saponaria, soapwort. We know today this is the basis of soap in many cases. So there was a special order of 7 ingredients that you would rub onto the stain to figure out if it was proper stain or not. And the Rambam says you can apply these same cleaning agents to the chatas stained clothing, chutz mimei raglayim, except for urine. One of the 7 ingredients was urine. And you don't do that. She'ein machnisim meraglayim lamikdash. We don't bring urine into the temple. It's not honorable. So you wouldn't do that. But everything else you could do and use it in cleaning this garment. Halacha Yud Aleph. This starts kind of like the second half of this chapter. Another special law that relates to chatas, to the sin offering. And actually, this is one of the sources for the idea of koshering utensils. A lot of the laws are learned from here, because there's a special law which applies by sacrificial meat, but some of the stuff is applied, some of the principles are applied to koshering regular vessels. It says that Amam klicheres. If you have a pottery utensil, shenizbash la by hachatas hanecheles, in which you cooked the eaten sin offering, ton shvira ba'azara, it has to be broken. Could not be used again. Ukli matches shenishbash la by, if you used a metal pot to cook the chatas meat in, ton mirika ushtifa b'mayim ba'azara. It has to be washed out. Mirika and shtifa, we'll soon see, it means with hot water and with cold water in the temple courtyard. Shanemar, as it says, it's a clear pasuk. Uchli cheres asher tevushal ba yishaver. The pottery utensil in which you cook the sin offering has to be broken. Straight up. Afal pishalei nemar kan b'makom kadosh, even though it doesn't say it has to be broken in the holy place, but we learn it from the blood washing. Hare dinan kedina kibus. The same law that applies to washing applies to them. Ma kibus habeged b'kodesh. The same way washing the clothing has to be done in the holy area. Af shviras kli cheres ushtifas kli matches umirikase b'kodesh. So the breaking of the pottery utensils, the washing of the metal utensils with the cold water and the hot water needs to be done in the holy area. The echad klisha bishal bay, or klisha hera l'soicher reteach. It applies whether it was the original pot in which you cooked the meat or you poured the meat into what's called iroi, pouring directly from the hot pot into another pot. That pot also has the same laws. If it's metal, it has to be kashered. If it's pottery, it has to be broken. Mirika b'chamin or shtifa b'tzaynin. It's actually the end of the verse. You see, being bichlina cheshes bushala Umoirak v'shutaf b'mayim, it has to be washed. Merika, which means like a deep clean, means with hot water. Shtifa b'tzainin. And then it says b'mayim, with water, that means loy b'yayin, v'loy b'mezeg, v'loy b'shar mashkin, not with wine, diluted stuff, other liquids, only water. The hamerika, the hashtifa, kimrika sakais, ushtifasai. This washing that we're referring to is like the same way you would rinse or cleanse a cup. In other words, same way when you wash a cup. This is from the Rambam and it's coming here to the Mishnah. Same way when you wash a cup, you want to be able that you want to be sure that it's totally clean. You don't leave any stain or any substance. Same thing over here. The hashvud v'ha'askala, if you have a spit, this is a roasting spit over here, and a grill, right? The metal utensil on which you do a grill today. Magilan b'mayim chamim al gabi ha'esh v'achar kach medichan. You have to kasher them in hot water over the fire, and then you wash them in the water. In other words, there's two stages to kosherizing it. One is right over the fire, because this is a principle that we have also in halacha when it comes to koshering vessels. Whatever method it was exposed to the substance which made it not kosher, it has to be exposed to the same method to make it kosher. So if it came not kosher over a fire, it has to become kosher by putting it over a fire. So these grills and spits, which are exposed directly to fire, if they were used to process or to cook chatas meat, they have to be first kosherized over the fire. Halacha Yud Gimel B'Amed Dvarim Amurim. When are we talking about? When does this law apply? If you cooked the meat in these pots after it was sprinkled the blood properly. But if you cooked it before the sprinkling, or you cooked meat of a sin offering which should have been burnt, not eaten, this law of washing doesn't apply. If you cooked only in part of the pot, doesn't matter. The whole pot is disqualified. Right? You have a massive cholent pot. It's hard to think about it in terms of our small pots, but think about a big commercial pot. Let's say you only made a cholent if the chatas meat in the bottom third, but the whole thing is disqualified. Yudalid sola habasar ba'avir tanur shel cheres. What if you roasted meat in the airspace of a pottery oven? In those days, the ovens used to be kind of like a diagonally rising structure, right? And so you had let's say you had an open fire in there, and you roasted it. Didn't touch the pottery outside; it just was roasted in there. So the Rambam says, "Yesh badavar safek im yishaver." There's a doubt. Should we break it? Bottom line, there was chatas cooked in it. Or maybe you don't break it because it didn't touch the walls of the utensil. Says the Rambam, at any rate, this law doesn't apply only to a sin offering. Any utensil used for sacrificial meat in a hot way, highest level sacrifices, lighter sacrifices, require the washing after the eating. The grill and the spit have to be again kosher with the eating. You don't, let's say you're a Kohen, you're going to have multiple sin offerings to eat today. You can't just leave it for 1 day and keep eating. As soon as you finish eating one, you have to kosher the spit and the grill, wash whatever utensils were used, whether it's metal or pottery. If it's a sin offering, you break the pottery. And you cook it again. Second time, third time. Whether it's metal or pottery. You keep on repeating the cycle till you finish eating. In other words, it's not one license for all the eatings. Every eating disqualifies the utensil anew, has to be kashered anew, and then can be used anew. If a utensil is made from dung, from animal manure, or from stone, or from earth, they don't require it to be kashered with the washing, even if it's a sin offering, a simple washing with cold water is fine. Now, the Rambam says a new law when it comes to chatas. Nemar bechatas, it says by a korban chatas, koil asher yiga bivsara yikdash. Anything which touches its flesh, its meat, becomes holy. It's referring to objects, not a person. Other food, other meat. And the way it works is liyos kamaya, it becomes as holy as it. Impsula hi hanegea b'pasol, if the meat of the sin offering is disqualified for whatever reason, whatever touches it becomes disqualified. Vim ksheda, if it's kosher, hanegea b'ye'achel kamaya b'ikdushasa, whatever touches it has to be eaten like it, with its status, its holiness. When the touching was long enough for it to have absorbed from the chatas meat. Aval negia b'lei havla eina mekadeshes. But if it simply touches it and there's no absorption, let's say
There is no what?
there's no absorption. Let's say it's just two cold pieces. I'm saying if it's not hot, there's no transfer. Say if it's just cold, then you don't have that law. The echad achatos ve'echad char kodshim, bein kodshim kalim, bein chamurim. This applies to a sin offering and to other sacrifices, whether it's lighter or holy level. Shenemar, because it says zois ha'toira la'oila lamincha. At the end of the passage about the offerings, it says this is the same law that applies to all the offerings, burnt offerings, flour offerings, chatas, which compares them all for these laws. What if the flesh of a chatas touched a wafer, a flatbread, and it was absorbed into it? It doesn't make the whole bread holy, just wherever it absorbed. You cut that out, and that's holy. You have a utensil in which you cook two level foods, either sacrificial meat and regular meat, or two levels of sacrificial meat, holy of holies and less holy. What do you do with the utensil? If there's enough that it has transferred taste, you treat it all as if it's the most stringent one. The utensil requires washing. It's in all matters treated like the stricter one. If it didn't transfer taste, the lighter meat is not like the stricter level meat. It has its regular leniencies of eating for longer periods of time, etc., for more people. But the utensil still requires to be washed out because of the holy level sacrifice that was cooked in it. Halacha yutes. Returning to the original conversation in the chapter about the clothing. Beged shenita zolav dam hachatas v'yotza chutz la'azara. Piece of clothing, chatas blood spritched on it, and it was taken out of the temple courtyard. Machzire la'azaro mechabse sham. You bring it back in, and you wash it in the azara as you're supposed to. Nitma chutz la'azara ketzad yasa. What if it was taken out, and then it became impure? Now you can't bring it back in. What do? Koirei kadesha yitar. Tear it up, so it becomes pure, because as we'll see, if you tear up clothing, and it's no longer useful, it becomes pure. Umachnise umechabse bifnim. Bring it in and wash it there. But you have to leave at least the size of a small cloth, untouched. Torah says clothing has to be big enough to be called legal clothing. Even though in this scenario, it would still be impure rabbinically. But for this mitzvah, we only care about the biblical level. Once most of it is torn, it's biblically pure. And that's enough to allow it back into the temple premises to launder it, clean out the blood as you're supposed to. Halacha chaf. Me'il shenita zolav dam chatas v'yotza v'nitma lachutz. What if there was a very rare case? The me'il, the blue cape worn by the Kohen Gadol. Same scenario. Chatas blood spritched on it. It was taken out of the temple courtyard. It became impure. If the only solution is to tear the clothing to make them pure, you can't do that to the me'il. It says clearly in the Torah, lo yikareya, you cannot rip it. So what do? If you'll tear it, you will be lashed, as we explained. It says that Rambam machnise paches misholosh etzbos umachabse bifnim. You stand outside and you bring it in increments of 3 hand breaths, 3 finger breaths, which is the size of a legal clothing. And then once you finish laundering it completely, you bring it back outside, put it in the mikvah, make it pure again, and bring it back in for service. What if you have a utensil, pottery pot, where you cooked sacrificial meat and it went out of the azara? You must bring it back in and break it in the holy area. Nitma bachutz, if it became impure, same thing. Find the workaround. Make a hole in it, the size of a small root, so it becomes pure. Bring it back in, break it inside. If you make it a bigger hole than that, you actually won't be able to bring it in. It's not a utensil, and you can only break utensils inside. And so you just leave it outside. If it was a metal utensil, same thing. You cooked in it, it left the temple courtyard. Take it back in, wash it on the inside. If it became impure, you destroy it in a way that it makes it pure, bring it back in. Yeah, in some way. Do some destructive act to it which makes it no longer useful.
Dent or something?
Bigger than a dent. There's exact parameters as to what makes a pot unusable anymore. But once you make it unusable, you bring it back in. Then you flatten it out till the dent or the destructive point is no longer there. And it's back to looking like a utensil. And then you wash it in the temple courtyard. And again, the reasoning for all this is if it was cooked in a copper utensil, has to be a utensil. You can only wash out in the temple courtyard actual utensils. So yes, make it a little bit destroyed so it becomes pure, but then make it back into the shape of a keli so you can wash it out and fulfill this special law related to the chatas.